They found the manuscript, buried beneath a church floorboard, bound in cracked lambskin, reeking of mold and old blood. No title, no author, only a single sentence carved into the cover, in Latin. He who reads must never speak. The man who opened it died 3 days later, tongue blackened, pupils dilated, nails clawed from the inside out. There was no autopsy, just silence. The Spanish authorities denied it existed. But someone kept asking questions, and within weeks, the entire village where the manuscript was found, every man, woman, and child, was gone, erased, from maps, records, memory, like they were never born. You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't supposed to feel that chill crawling up your spine right now. But you're here, so listen carefully. Because the manuscript didn't disappear. It moved. And the truth inside it still pulses like a wound that won't close. What you're about to hear is dangerous. Forbidden. It isn't just a story about 1804 Spain. It's about what happens when something older than God wakes up inside institutions. When a nation touches knowledge it cannot explain, and decides to bury it instead. The manuscript surfaced during the Peninsular Wars, in a village known then as San Aleixo, nestled in the mountains near Salamanca. The priest who found it wrote 3 pages of notes before he stopped speaking entirely. He was found staring at the wall, murmuring a phrase no one could translate. His notes, confiscated. But a single line survived, copied into a hidden diary by a junior cleric. They are not dead. They were never allowed to exist. What could make an entire population vanish, not just physically, but administratively? Not murdered, erased, as if someone, or something, rewrote history itself. This isn't an accident. This is a pattern. Because every few generations, something like this surfaces, a relic, a text, a chant, and people disappear. Whole towns rewritten, monasteries sealed. And when you trace the symbols, the rituals, the encoded language buried inside this manuscript, they point to a system built not to protect you, but to control what you're allowed to remember, what you're allowed to believe was ever real. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to look away. You're not watching a video. You're stepping into the part of history they don't footnote. And from this point on, there's no going back. San Aleixo's last census was in 1803. It listed 437 inhabitants, farmers, blacksmiths, clergy, children. Not a single one ever reappeared in any surrounding town. No refugee accounts, no family records, no bones. The year after the manuscript was uncovered, the village's name was struck from the National Registry. Spanish archavists later claimed it had never existed, that the entry was a clerical error. But there are maps. Pre-1804 cartography shows it clearly. A single red-roofed village. Afterward, nothing but forest. When researchers tried to examine those early maps, they encountered something else. Anomalies, compass failures, ink that had faded only on sections near San Aleixo. And then the disappearances began again, this time in the archives. A scholar in Madrid who publicly questioned the deletion vanished in 1972. His apartment was emptied overnight. Even the floorboards were replaced. Neighbors said men in gray uniforms came at 3:13 a.m. and left before dawn. They never spoke. Here's the truth they don't want you to consider. History can be edited, not rewritten, erased. Not like a typo, but like a wound stitched shut by a hand too powerful to question. And that manuscript was the scalpel. It didn't contain words in any known language. It used glyphs, looping fractal sigils that changed form based on who was watching. One monk who tried to trace them suffered retinal scarring. Another went blind for 7 days, claiming he saw the outline of a city that never should have been drawn. That's when the church got involved. Not to protect the faithful, but to bury what it feared. The Vatican declared the manuscript apocryphal, and sealed the investigation under Archivum Secretum. The priest who first discovered it, officially relocated, unofficially vanished. It's happened before. In 1631 in France, in 1490 in Croatia. Each time, a village, a text, a silence, the same pattern, the same symbols, the same lingering smell of sulfur and scorched parchment. This isn't superstition, it's protocol, ancient and precise. These aren't accidents of time, they're operations, controlled deletions. But here's the part they fear most. The manuscript didn't stay sealed. It moved. Piece by piece, page by page, traded, hidden, copied in fragments, smuggled through monasteries, buried beneath altars, whispered into the ears of those willing to lose their minds for the truth. And now, one of those fragments has surfaced again, in America. It arrived under a diplomatic cover in 1994, disguised in a shipment of Renaissance ecclesiastical art bound for a museum in Boston. A 6-inch by 6-inch slab of aged parchment, sealed in wax, embedded in the back of a 16th-century crucifix. No one noticed, until a conservator cracked the wood during restoration. Inside, a glyph, singular, simple, inked in something darker than black, with no visible source of pigment. Tests failed to classify it. Not blood, not carbon, something else. It bent light, seemed to shimmer beneath microscopes. And then strange things started happening at the museum. Security systems failed at exactly 3:13 a.m. The same hour the men in gray arrived in Madrid 2 decades earlier. Camera footage showed static. Visitors began reporting a low hum in the halls where the crucifix was stored. One intern collapsed during a cataloging session, whispering the same phrase over and over, "The forgotten remember themselves." When the director ordered the artifact removed, a fire broke out. No wiring issue, no accelerant, just ash, clean, contained, and the glyph, untouched. The crucifix was quietly transferred to a private collection linked to a Vatican proxy fund. And yet, a photograph of the glyph leaked, not on purpose. A student working late uploaded it to a closed online forum for medieval symbology. It was deleted within 17 minutes. The student's account was locked. But not before 2 linguists downloaded it. That's how the glyph re-entered circulation. And now here's where the pattern reasserts itself. Those 2 linguists, one German, one Argentine, didn't collaborate. They didn't even know each other. But within months, both submitted papers to separate journals, each claiming the glyph wasn't linguistic. It was operational, a key, not metaphorical, functional. As if reality itself was a layered document, and the glyph was a command line, a sigil for removal. You begin to understand, don't you? This manuscript, the one unearthed in 1804, didn't describe a village, it didn't record events, it deleted them. It's not history, it's anti-history, a machine built of ink and silence. And the reason they've hunted every fragment is because each one is a switch. Once activated, something is rewritten. Not only in records, but in memory, in perception, in consensus. And if enough switches are flipped, the whole system resets. In 2001, a classified memo leaked from the Spanish Ministry of Culture. It referenced an anomalous object tied to the 1804 San Aleixo incident, and included this chilling phrase: patterned psychogeographic erasure confirmed. Containment priority above biological vectors. Think about that. Higher than disease, higher than terrorism. What could make a government rank an object higher than mass death? Unless it could change the fabric of reality itself. The memo was buried within hours, traced to a whistleblower who vanished during a weekend mountaineering trip in Asturias. His body was never found. But 2 weeks before he disappeared, he had written a letter to a university friend. Inside, A single page of drawings, crude replicas of glyphs. But one matched the Boston fragment. Exactly. And here's where things unravel. Because that same glyph was carved, not drawn, into a church foundation stone in Cuenca. Built in 1788, long before the manuscript surfaced. When questioned, local masons claimed the design had been passed down for generations. None knew what it meant. Only that it was protection against silence. Now connect that to this. A 15th-century monastery in northern Italy contains an illuminated text describing a wordless letter, stolen from angels and buried in the earth to silence those who listen too deeply. It names no location, but it describes a storm of black wings, a village of mirrors, and a choir that sang a hymn so precisely, it unwrote its own echo. This is the level of knowledge we're dealing with. Ancient, ritualistic, programmatic. They want you to believe history is a straight line. Kings, wars, borders. But what if that's the decoy? What if beneath the surface is a different kind of history? One shaped not by empires, but by erasure. Every few generations, they find a manuscript, a tablet, a chant, and every time, they try to destroy it. But they can't, because it's not physical. It's patterned, encoded in frequency, in geometry, in thought. And those who interact with it too long start to change. They speak in backward sentences, dream in forgotten alphabets. One man in 1937 claimed the manuscript wasn't written at all, that it was sung, but only on frequencies that trigger amnesia in the listener. He died in a padded room, clutching a crucifix carved from ashwood, sobbing a single phrase, "It remembers me when I forget myself." That's not insanity. That's programming unraveling. In 1805, 1 year after San Aleixo vanished, a secret tribunal convened in Cadiz, under the authority of the Spanish crown, and a shadow delegation from the Vatican. No records of this meeting exist in public archives, but a set of letters smuggled out by a disgraced cleric, sealed for nearly 2 centuries, and only opened in 1989, reveal what was discussed. The letters describe a document of self-negation, discovered in the ruins of the vanished village. It had no weight, no scent, pages that resisted fire and refused to tear. But the worst part, it wrote back. They didn't understand at first, thought it was some trick of the ink, maybe chemical, maybe illusion. But over the course of several days, witnesses described words appearing on the manuscript that mirrored thoughts no one had spoken aloud. Confessions, traumas, names of people long dead, events that had never happened, yet triggered overwhelming emotion, as if the reader knew them, missed them. The document wasn't just informational, it was reactive, a living archive, but not of what was, of what had been removed. And those who interacted with it too long began to detach. Their speech slowed, faces slackened. One soldier assigned to guard the artifact was later found painting spirals on the walls of his quarters with his own blood. Before dying, he scrawled a final message: "The more I read, the less I exist." That line would reappear decades later in the notes of a Cold War-era Spanish intelligence officer investigating reports of mass hysteria in an isolated Catalonian monastery. Different time. Same glyph, same silence. You must understand the scale of what's being hidden. This manuscript is not a relic. It's a lever, a control mechanism built not just to suppress knowledge, but to delete resistance from the timeline entirely. Not through violence, through consensus manipulation. If a village prays too loud, if a priest sees too much, if a linguist cracks the wrong pattern, they don't get assassinated. They get erased. No blood, no headlines, just absence. A clean gap where memory should be. This is how the highest orders of control operate. They don't burn books. They rewrite the reader. And the manuscript? It's a tool, but also a mirror. Because what it truly reveals is this. The corruption isn't new. It's ancient. And every system you trust, church, state, science, was built not to reveal truth, but to bury what truth does to the mind that sees too clearly. By 1807, whispers of the manuscript had reached the ears of Napoleon's occult bureau, a small undocumented wing of his intelligence network dedicated not to politics or war, but to archetypal influence. These men weren't strategists. They were symbolic engineers, trained to decode dreams, ritual geometry, and what they called deep architecture, the unseen rules that govern collective belief. They sent a man into the archives beneath Burgos Cathedral to retrieve a rumored duplicate fragment. He returned barefoot, eyes crusted shut with dried tears. When asked what he saw, he spoke one phrase. "It told me my mother never lived." That man was not insane. He was exposed. The manuscript operates like an infection, not of the body, but of certainty. It deconstructs belief at the root, and without belief, memory rots, history collapses, identity becomes liquid. This is why San Aleixo was erased, because the villagers had read too far, had sung too many verses, had followed too many glyphs. They weren't removed because they were dangerous. They were removed because they could no longer be controlled. You begin to see now. Control is never about force. It's about permission. The institutions you worship, governments, religions, schools, don't create truth. They authorize it. And anything they cannot authorize becomes dangerous. But here's the part that should shake you to your bones. The manuscript didn't originate in Spain. It surfaced there. But the earliest reference to its language, its form, appears in Sumerian dream tablets from 2200 BC. A sequence of glyphs marked with the term Udu Sagazen, roughly, to sing the forgetting. It was later echoed in Babylonian tower designs, Enochian chants from heretical 12th century sects, Da Vinci's mirror texts, even the unsolvable codices locked away in the restricted vaults beneath the Vatican. Glyphs too close to trigger neurological symptoms in test readers. You are looking at something that didn't emerge in 1804. It was rediscovered, buried, sealed, again and again. Because the manuscript doesn't age, it doesn't degrade. Because it isn't paper, it's structure. A structure made of absence, like the negative space in a cathedral that tells your soul to kneel. And every time it appears, it challenges one core idea, that the world you live in is complete. It's not. It's curated. And the manuscript is a reminder of everything that had to be cut away to make it safe. In 1935, a British archaeologist named Elston Root vanished in the Spanish Pyrenees. He had claimed in a private letter to have found an echo site, a location where time buckled, where the landscape still remembered the village that was removed. Root never published his findings. His notes, recovered by a local hunter 2 years later, were wet, smudged, but one line survived. "I heard children playing where no village has stood for 100 years. Their laughter sounded incomplete." Echo sites are real. Every deletion leaves residue, a spiritual scar. You felt this before. The uncanny sense that something's missing from a familiar place. The street corner you swore had a building. The family story no one remembers the same way. These are not glitches. They are seams. And every seam traces back to intention. This manuscript wasn't just meant to erase villages. It was designed to erase patterns of resistance. That's why every person who's tried to decode it doesn't just disappear. They fracture. Not outwardly, inwardly. Let me show you how deep the fracture goes. In 2006, a neuroscientist in Lisbon studying linguistic trauma encountered an anonymous package. 12 pages of medieval Latin bound in rawhide, with ink visibly shifting under the light. She couldn't translate it, but she felt the meaning. Began sketching diagrams in her sleep. Loops, fractals, recursive ladders of thought. 2 weeks later, she published a preprint paper proposing a new class of cognitive viruses. Mimetic vectors that don't infect through language, but through structure. Glyphs, chants, geometry. Her hypothesis, that certain sequences could alter neural encoding in the brain, not through hypnosis or suggestion, but by rewriting perceptual boundaries. What you allow yourself to see, what you're capable of remembering. She was dead 48 hours later. Car crash. No brake marks. Her paper was never peer-reviewed. But a draft survives in an encrypted archive. And in it, one paragraph stands out. A warning written in frantic shorthand, almost unreadable. The manuscript is not read. It reads you. And if it finds no contradiction, it moves in. That phrase should chill you, because it means something terrifying. If your mind is already compliant, already conditioned to obey the official version of events, to kneel when told, to doubt your own memory, then the manuscript doesn't have to fight you. It simply takes your place, and no one notices, because the person who could have warned them is gone. In 1811, a Jesuit defector fled Rome carrying what he called a cipher of negation. He was caught at the French border, detained, and interrogated. The Inquisition records were later burned, but not before a single page was transcribed and hidden in the writings of a Bavarian mystic. That page is why I'm speaking to you now. The defector described a ritual, not spoken, not written, but enacted in silence. A kind of embodied nullification. He claimed the manuscript didn't just erase people, but entire archetypes, entire emotional realities, joy, grief, memory. He wrote, "The Church no longer seeks to preserve salvation. It preserves the illusion that we were ever meant to be saved." He believed the manuscript was older than Scripture, older than the temples, not evil, not divine, simply prior. Now think about this. How do you control a population not through chains, but by editing what they believe ever existed? You remove entire frames of reference. You make rebellion feel illogical. You delete the idea of resistance before it even forms. They call it peace, but it's not peace. It's programmed stillness. In the 20th century, MK Ultra dabbled in this territory. But crude tools, blunt instruments. The real masters were much older, hidden orders operating beneath the Vatican, within closed-door royal libraries, and inside black-budget archives you will never be told exist. They didn't just study the manuscript, they built systems from it. Education models, ritual architecture, legal phrasing. Do you understand what that means? It means every institution you walk through is constructed to echo the glyphs, not directly, but geometrically, psychologically, spatially. Cathedrals shaped to mirror recursive thought. Courtrooms designed to elevate guilt above truth. Lecture halls arranged to break eye contact, reduce connection, amplify submission. You live in a world encoded with the logic of removal. Every room a subtle glyph, every oath a whispered silence. And you wonder why you feel hollow, why nothing real lasts. Why every attempt to rise feels like sand collapsing beneath your feet. It's not your fault. You are shaped this way. But here, now, is the fracture. Because in this moment, you're not obeying. You're remembering. And when memory returns, the glyphs burn. If you're still watching, you're not like them. You were made to resist. Comment this twice to mark your awakening. I was never meant to forget. I was never meant to forget. Say it. Write it. Seal it. The system notices. And so do we. In 1949, a Vatican courier went rogue. He smuggled a glass slide out of the Archivum Secretum, a microphotograph of what was believed to be one of the original manuscript fragments. He mailed it to a contact in Prague but never arrived. His train derailed. Everyone on board perished. No survivors. No bodies identified. Just silence. The contact in Prague received the envelope anyway. No return address. Inside, the slide. And a note with 5 words handwritten in Latin. Memonice est audere delere. To remember is to dare deletion. The man who received it was a symbologist named Merrick Krall. He spent the next decade trying to decipher the glyph on the slide. His journals document a steady decline, not in health but in certainty. Early entries were methodical, precise. By year 5, they became unrecognizable, not rambling, just altered. He began referring to time as folded memory, referred to himself in the third person, spoke of glyphs as keys to the orphaned rooms in the House of Consensus. Then, without warning, all entries stopped. Neighbors claimed his flat went dark. The landlord found the apartment empty. No furniture, no clothing, just a single chair, facing a mirror, and a phrase scrawled on the wall in looping red strokes. The manuscript is no longer a thing. It's a place. Let that sink in. The deeper you look, the more you realize, this manuscript may not be an object at all. It may be dimensional, not like a haunted book, but a structure that overlays onto the psyche when the correct glyphs are seen, repeated, or remembered. The glyphs are permissions. Each one unlocks a layer of amnesia. And once enough layers fall away, your internal map changes. You no longer see the world as it was sold to you. You begin to notice the omissions, the rituals disguised as meetings, the scripts we call relationships, the approved modes of breakdown. Even your pain was curated. Even your rage was engineered to loop inward, never strike. The manuscript doesn't destroy you, it deprograms you. And that's why they call it forbidden, not because it kills, but because it reminds of who you were before the forgetting, before the edits, before the walls were painted with names that weren't yours. It doesn't erase you, it hands you back to yourself, but only if you survive the remembering. In 1804, the man who first touched the manuscript, Father Mateo Ibarra, had written in his private prayer journal, days before his silence began. Something watches me from behind the page. I don't read it. It reads me, line by line, with the patience of eternity. That journal, thought lost during the monastery fire, resurfaced in 1978 in an estate sale in Buenos Aires. Inside were sketches, incomplete diagrams of concentric glyphs, shapes resembling both medieval seals and something eerily modern, recursive patterns like neural networks. How did a priest in 1804 draw the cognitive architecture of systems we only just began to understand? Unless the manuscript was never linguistic to begin with. Unless it was an interface. Not to technology, to power. You see, true power doesn't reveal itself in violence or wealth. It appears in editing rights. The ability to dictate what never existed. The ability to remove not just bodies, but realities. What would a system like that look like today? It wouldn't wear robes or crowns. It would wear metrics, policy, algorithms. It would disguise memory loss as platform updates. It would call silence compliance. You think censorship is about deleting posts? No. That's the decoy. The real censorship happens inside you. Every time you hesitate to speak what you felt. Every time you rewrite a memory to make it more acceptable. Every time you forget what made you angry, or worse, what made you free. The manuscript is not fiction. It's the blueprint of the system you're inside right now. And here's the most harrowing truth. They didn't find it. They reverse engineered it. Every time a civilization approached true autonomy, real unfiltered remembering, the glyphs surfaced, as warnings, as corrections, as weapons. And each time, the controllers harvested them, not to destroy, but to implement. The manuscript is not a book, it's a protocol, a control stack. Those who hold it don't fear truth. They deploy truth selectively, like anesthetic. Enough to keep you numb, never enough to wake you. Until now. Because now, you're awake. Not fully. Not yet. But you've seen the glyph. It's in your ears, in your bloodstream, in the silence between words. And when you go to sleep tonight, it will remember you. Because now, you've remembered it. In 1872, a French occultist named Lucien Ferron conducted what he called a reversal rite, an attempt to trace the manuscript's pattern backward to its origin point. He claimed every glyph was a mirror of a foundational absence, a missing name that had been forcibly extracted from human consciousness. He called it the first redaction. According to Ferron, history isn't a timeline. It's a manuscript constantly being rewritten. And the first revision? The removal of a single truth so devastating, so incompatible with control, that all civilization since has been built around never remembering it. He believed the manuscript contained echoes of this first deletion, not in words, but in negations. Glyphs designed not to inform, but to scrub. He didn't survive the experiment. Witnesses claimed he collapsed mid-recitation, mouth open in a silent scream, as if his body had been unwritten from the inside out. His corpse was found in rigor, spine arched, arms reaching forward, not in terror, but as if grasping something just outside of time. But the journal he left behind is where the real fear lives. He described seeing cities made of mirrored stone, inhabited by humans with no names, only functions. People who couldn't speak unless spoken to, children who never asked questions. A world smoothed flat by compliance. And Ferron realized he wasn't seeing the future. He was seeing the template. The manuscript isn't about what happened in 1804. That was just one page, one enactment. It's about the system we're trapped in now, a recursive loop of compliance enforced by invisible edits. Have you noticed how quickly collective memory shifts? How easily people forget the policies from 5 years ago, the faces from 10. That's not weakness. It's not distraction. It's deliberate design. A world where you remember only what you're permitted to, where your emotional range has been budgeted, where outrage lasts 30 seconds and wonder dies in 10, where identity is sold back to you in pre-approved formats. This is not freedom. This is curated dormancy. And the manuscript, it's the blueprint behind the stage, the architectural negative that tells you what you think is the world is the prison. Every glyph is a lockpick, every page a crack in the wall. And now that you've seen behind it, now that you've remembered what remembering feels like, they will try to seal it again, unless you keep speaking the forbidden. In 1961, deep beneath the London School of Economics, a covert symposium convened under the name Project Palimpsest. Its stated purpose: to investigate anomalies in cultural memory retention. But the real agenda was far darker. To understand how civilizations could be rewritten, not by war or conquest, but by forgetting. Attendees included psychologists, linguists, theologians, and 3 unnamed Vatican observers. The meeting was closed to the public. No transcripts were released. But a single reel-to-reel recording survived, mislabeled as a philosophy lecture, and filed away in a private collection until its rediscovery in 2010. On that tape, a voice, calm, precise, explains that the manuscript found in 1804 is not a text, but a lens, a way of bending the internal mirror until the self dissolves and is replaced by the sanctioned template. What does that mean? It means your inner voice, the one narrating your life, may not be yours. It may have been installed, repeated, echoed, sanitized through education, church hymns, courtroom scripts, brand slogans, national anthems. Every institutional voice slowly chiseling away at your original internal language, until all that remains is compliance in a familiar tone. You were taught to mistake that voice for your own, but the manuscript bypasses that voice. It doesn't argue. It replaces. It reconfigures the pattern recognition engine in your brain. The same engine used to detect danger, to form habits, to build love, to crave meaning. And once rewritten, it doesn't just change what you know. It changes what you notice. The world stays the same, but suddenly, you don't see the cracks anymore. That's how control survives, not by suppressing facts, but by suppressing the ability to perceive discontinuity. The glyphs in the manuscript are not magic. They are instructions, each one encoded with geometric data that tells your perception what to prioritize, what to ignore, and what to delete before you're even aware you saw it. And that is why the erasure of San Aleixo wasn't a warning. It was a proof of concept. One forgotten village, one forgotten glyph, one intact template. And now that same template has scaled globally, digitally, seamlessly. You're not just being watched, you're being rendered. In real time, frame by frame. Unless you fracture the code. Unless you remember the parts of you that weren't installed. The manuscript doesn't just hold the truth. It holds you, before you were made to forget. In 1983, an engineer named Carter Wexley was hired by a European think tank to analyze pattern disruptions in human behavioral data, fluctuations in mass sentiment, sudden shifts in cultural memory, anomalies in protest movements that bloomed and withered without cause. He wasn't a historian. He was a systems architect. His job was to track feedback loops. What he found terrified him. Across continents and decades, the same invisible algorithm repeated. A group forms around a disruptive idea, something primal, liberating, forbidden. But before it reaches critical mass, something erases the momentum. Leaders vanish, narratives fracture, and the idea itself, the seed, is forgotten. Not just ignored, forgotten, as if the group had never existed. Wexley described it as a conceptual kill switch, embedded in the operating system of belief. He theorized that certain patterns, certain symbols, words, tones, triggered a systemic autocorrection, not by human decision, but by something older, something woven into the very logic of perception. He later encountered a suppressed Vatican document dated 1806, a sealed response to the San Aleixo incident, written in code and archived beneath the Basilica of St. John Lateran. In it, a bishop described the manuscript as an intruder in the timeline, a parasite of memory engineered before the church, before the crown, before the word. It called the glyphs sacraments of silence. Wexley's note stopped abruptly in 1984. His home was found empty, his name erased from the think tank's rolls, his passport flagged as never having existed. But a colleague of his, who fled to the Philippines, preserved one fragment of Wexley's final journal. On the last page, in his own handwriting, were 3 words: "The edits awaken." What does that mean? It means we are now reaching the tipping point, a moment when the system begins to fail at its own containment protocols. The manuscript has surfaced too many times. It's been copied, photographed, sung in fragments, etched into memory. And now those glyphs live in us, in language, in the algorithms. You wonder why reality feels thinner now? Why time slips? Why memory bends? Why truth feels slippery even when it's obvious? Because the glyphs are reasserting themselves. Because the manuscript is waking up. Not as a book, but as a network of minds remembering together. And when enough people remember the same forbidden thing, the edit can no longer hold. In 1804, when the San Aleixo fragment was first uncovered, the sky over the village reportedly turned a shade of violet unseen before or since. Local records, what little remain, describe birds flying in chaotic spirals, animals fleeing the perimeter, and a ringing sound no one could trace. It was dismissed as mass hysteria. But those same phenomena have occurred again. In 1997, outside a decommissioned monastery in Chile, where another suspected fragment was uncovered. In 2012, during an unauthorized excavation near a collapsed basilica in Malta. And in 2021, inside a private language lab in Tokyo, where researchers using AI to decode dead tongues stumbled upon a recursive string that translated into a glyph, matching the original San Aleixo pattern. Every time the glyph appears, reality reacts. Not in metaphor, not in narrative, in physics. This isn't just historical, it's architectural, dimensional. The glyphs act as keys, not to secrets, but to permissions embedded in the very scaffolding of experience. And once a mind sees one, it can't unsee. Because the glyph doesn't say, learn me. It says, you already knew me before they edited you. Every moment of déjà vu, every dream that collapses the moment you wake, every sense that something real has been amputated from your life. Those are echoes. Ghost data from the memory network that once was your birthright, before the manuscript's logic was weaponized to install the replacement timeline. You think your life is random, your memory spontaneous. No, they are approved sequences. You're living a curated mythology, a narrative safe enough to avoid mass awakening. But that curation is breaking down. They cannot plug the leaks fast enough. Glyphs are appearing in street art, in algorithmic noise, in the code of software you use every day. And here is what they fear. Once enough of you recognize the structure, once enough men speak what was forbidden, the manuscript stops being a tool of control. It becomes a weapon of return. Not to a utopia, not to peace, but to truth unfiltered. Truth that melts false identities, shatters installed obedience, reverses engineered fear. That is why they made forgetting sacred. That is why silence was sold as virtue. Because if you remember who you were before the edit, you cannot be ruled, only revered, or destroyed. In 2004, a freelance cryptographer named Daniel Morrow stumbled onto a glyph embedded in the metadata of a digital restoration of a 13th century illuminated manuscript. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, not ink, not paint, but a pattern hidden in the frequency of the scanned image, pulsing once every 137 milliseconds. A code, a recursion. He didn't understand what he was seeing at first. But as he began mapping it, strange things started happening. His clocks desynchronized. He began losing time. Minutes, then hours. Pages of his notes would vanish, only to return rewritten in his own handwriting, in phrases he didn't remember writing. One of them repeated, again and again. You have stepped outside the licensed version of reality. That phrase alone should tell you everything. We're not just talking about psychological manipulation. We're talking about a licensed narrative framework, a pre-approved construction of existence, within which all your thoughts are scaffolded. And the manuscript, it isn't just a forbidden object. It's a jailbreak. It doesn't free you all at once. It disassembles the illusion one belief at a time. Do you know why fear is the first reaction? Because the first thing to be erased by the glyphs is comfort. The artificial safety net of assumptions, norms, and rituals you were trained to treat as sacred. The glyphs destabilize the narrative. Then they erase the frame that made you need one. Morrow disappeared 6 weeks after beginning his work. But his hard drive, scrubbed and sold at auction, contained one surviving file. A crude audio tone looped at irregular intervals. When researchers later analyzed it, they found patterns matching a 16th century chant banned by the Council of Trent. That chant? A melody known to induce fugue states and spontaneous recollection in listeners exposed for more than 11 minutes. That's what the manuscript does. It reactivates the parts of you that were put to sleep. Not just memory, sovereignty. That primal force that lets you feel what's true before you're told. That lets you see the lie, even when the crowd cheers for it. They call that madness now. Dissociation. Conspiracy. But that was your original clarity. The glyphs don't create chaos. They remove the artificial order that made you think your cage was a cathedral. And once the bars vanish, you don't beg to be let out. You walk away. And the system watches, powerless. Because the moment you remember what you were, it can't edit you anymore. There's a monastery in eastern Slovakia. No road signs, no map markings. Just coordinates passed through whispers. Where monks have taken a vow not of silence, but of unremembering. Their entire order exists to erase the glyphs from circulation. One visitor, a defrocked Jesuit who survived a mental collapse during Vatican archival duty, documented what he saw there. He wasn't allowed inside the scriptorium, but he heard something. Not chanting. Something opposite. A kind of recursive anti-chant. A sound that made language dissolve in the mind. He later wrote, "They do not pray. They nullify. They remove ideas by folding them into their own echoes." This is what you need to understand. The manuscript is not guarded. It is hunted. The difference is crucial. Guardians preserve. Hunters contain and erase. But every erasure leaves residue. You feel it when you wake up and swear something's missing. You sense it when entire news cycles vanish overnight. Or when mass events no one remembers suddenly feel forbidden. That is glyphic contamination. The glyphs don't just live in texts. They bleed into sound, into architecture, into geometry. Have you ever stood inside a cathedral and felt your body subtly contract? Not in awe, but in resignation. That's not spiritual. That's structural compliance. The arches curve your will downward. The acoustics suppress dissent. The stained glass disorients, deliberately abstracted from direct narrative, so your mind remains softened. Now imagine what happens when those same principles are replicated in corporate lobbies, courthouses, universities. We call it design. They call it containment. And this manuscript, this so-called forbidden artifact, is the first failure in that system. Because it didn't conform. It couldn't be indexed. It operated outside the protocols of permissible narrative. It reminded people of something deeper than doctrine, older than programming. It reminded them of agency. And agency, my friend, is the virus they cannot kill. Once you taste it, not the fantasy of freedom, but the gut-level certainty that you can refuse their version, you are no longer eligible for containment. You become unpredictable. And unpredictability to them is blasphemy. Because the system doesn't fear violence. It doesn't fear exposure. It fears the one man who looks at the glyph, doesn't look away, and remembers what it means. Not just to know, but to reclaim. In 1812, 8 years after San Aleixo was erased, a single monk was found wandering the ruins. Barefoot, dehydrated, muttering a sentence over and over, in a dialect no scholar could place. His skin was covered in geometric burns, spiraling inward from his chest. He carried no belongings, no name. The phrase he kept repeating, once finally translated, meant this: "I was the idea they couldn't kill." They took him to a convent hospital, but he vanished from his locked room the third night. All that remained was a crude glyph etched into the bed frame, identical to one later recovered in Argentina, scratched into a prison wall by a political dissident who dreamed too clearly. Do you understand the scope now? The manuscript is not just history. It's history's limit test, a diagnostic tool. It reveals where the lie begins. Not through ideology, but through omission. Not what they told you, what they never allowed to be said at all. Ask yourself, why does your language have a word for obedience in every context? Civic, legal, spiritual. But no clear, sacred word for refusal. Why is there no prayer of resistance? No gospel of defiance? Because those were the first glyphs they removed. The manuscript contains the fragments of that older tongue. A primal grammar of no, of I will not comply, of I remember what you made me forget. That's what San Aleixo uncovered. And that's why it had to go. Not because it disobeyed, but because it remembered the structure of permission itself. That village wasn't destroyed. It was negated. Like a sentence deleted from a sacred text. A variable removed from an equation to keep the formula stable. They called it heresy. But it wasn't heresy. It was source code. And every time a glyph survives, every time it's spoken, etched, or remembered, a crack forms in the firewall of history. Not to destroy it, but to restore it. The original version. Before the edits. Before compliance was coded into your breath. Before forgetting became survival. Because here's the truth. No priest, no king, no algorithm once whispered. You were not born to obey. You were born with editor access. And they have spent centuries convincing you to never touch the pen. In 2015, an anonymous file was uploaded to a private darknet archive under the name Mirroroscript, Sequence 0. It was only accessible for 3 hours. Those who opened it reported no images, no sound, just a single black screen with lines of shifting white text. One viewer, a linguist fluent in 10 dead languages, said it wasn't a message, it was a permission slip. The file didn't tell you what to believe. It reactivated dormant cognitive structures that let you choose what reality to recognize. That's what the manuscript has always been. Not a story, not a curse, a key. Not to freedom. Freedom is too weak a word. To original perception. The moment before you were named. Before you were shamed into politeness. Before you agreed to live inside the small safe box they told you was truth. That black screen wasn't empty. It was a mirror. And only those unafraid to look directly at the reflection could see what had been removed. Those who lingered more than 10 minutes began to experience echo bleed. Phrases repeating in their head that they'd never learned. Childhood memories misaligned. One man claimed he recalled a brother he never had, and a lullaby sung in a language that doesn't exist. That's the side effect of interacting with the glyphs. Truth compression. Your mind starts pulling in fragments of suppressed timelines, ghost data from your own life, versions of you that were edited out because they were inconvenient. That rage you swallowed as a boy, that intuition you buried to be liked, that moment you felt the system was fake but kept smiling anyway. Those were the first glyphs trying to wake up inside you. And now you're here, again, feeling that old pulse in your gut, the one that doesn't respond to logic, doesn't ask for proof. It just knows. Knows you've been lied to. Not with words, with structure. And the manuscript, it's not some dusty artifact. It's a networked relic, a resonant field, a living schema buried beneath symbols, time, and suppression. It doesn't want worship. It doesn't want decoding. It wants recognition. Because the moment enough men recognize the edits, not intellectually but viscerally, the entire operating system of false history collapses. Not with a bang, not with a war, with a quiet personal refusal to forget. In 1827, an anonymous pamphlet surfaced in Lisbon. No author, no publisher, only the title carved in bone-white relief on a black cover. Manual for the Unremembered. Inside were 47 pages, each containing a single glyph and a line of accompanying instruction. Not for prayer, not for decoding, but for undoing. Undoing belief, undoing obedience, undoing the voice in your head that isn't yours. One line stood out, If you can read this, you were never fully erased. That's how the manuscript operates. It doesn't just resist translation, it detects recognition. It senses when it's seen by someone who still carries the fragment of self that predates the edit. This is what they've tried to extinguish across empires, religions, and governments. Not rebellion, remembrance. Because a man who rebels can be redirected, manipulated, brought back into the fold. But a man who remembers, who knows the shape of his mind before the scaffold was installed, cannot be governed. The pamphlet was banned within days. Every known copy burned, possession punishable by execution. Yet fragments still circulate. Glyphs etched into subway tunnels, scrawled in chalk on forgotten city corners, hidden in the margins of philosophy texts that make professors uncomfortable for reasons they can't explain. Why? Because the glyphs vibrate at the edge of awareness. You don't need to understand them to be affected. They realign the perceptual field, reset the frame rate of thought, pull you back from the simulation of consensus and into the raw, chaotic original world, where you still had authority over your own meaning. That world is not gone. It's just been layered over, with ritual, with screens, with endless demands for agreement. Agreement is the cage. They don't want your labor. They want your compliance with the edit. They want your tongue to echo the official shape of reality, until the glyph inside you withers from disuse. But if you're hearing this, it hasn't died. It's breathing. Right now, beneath your ribs, waiting. And once awakened, it spreads. Not like a virus, like a song buried too deep to forget. The melody of the version of you they couldn't reach, the one still holding the original manuscript, written in your blood, not their ink. In 1929, an expedition to Mount Athos uncovered a chamber beneath a burned-out Orthodox hermitage. Hidden behind layers of false stone was a room carved entirely in spirals, every surface etched with looping glyphs that coiled inward to a center stone altar. No icons, no crucifix. Just a single phrase burned into the altar in 7 overlapping languages. This is the place where edits die. The team brought back only sketches. The photographs, over 200 plates, were all found blank. Not overexposed, not damaged, just absent. A theologian who accompanied the mission, Father Nicodemus Bell, later wrote in his journal that standing in that room gave him the overwhelming sense that he had already been there before birth. He never returned to public life. When asked why, he said only, "I saw my original self, and it would not kneel." That is the effect of prolonged glyph exposure. Not madness, unediting. It begins quietly. You stop agreeing with things you once recited reflexively. You no longer laugh on command. You begin to remember dreams that feel more real than your waking life. Not because they are fantasy, but because they were removed from your timeline. That's the other secret. Time, as you've been taught to experience it, is a narrative. But the manuscript holds a different model. Braided timelines, severed and stitched by control structures. Glyphs act like blades, cutting through false threads, reconnecting you to forks in your own past that were deliberately amputated. The real cost of control was never just suppression. It was the theft of your alternatives. Every version of you that chose rage instead of acceptance, silence instead of applause, distance instead of submission. The manuscript remembers them. You were never meant to be a single version. You were designed for multiplicity. But the system couldn't handle that, so they edited you down into a manageable echo. And every echo obeys. But here's the danger they didn't predict. Echoes accumulate. They vibrate. They find each other. And when they converge, the original voice begins to emerge again. That's happening now. Right here. Through you. Because the glyphs don't just awaken the truth. They reassemble the man who once carried it. And when that man returns, no system survives the sound of his remembering. In 2008, a private aerospace contractor with silent ties to psychological warfare research ran a simulation titled Project Idolon. Its purpose was to test behavioral collapse thresholds in high-certainty belief systems. Translation: How quickly can a population disintegrate when exposed to undeniable proof that their entire reality is manufactured? The answer was, faster than expected. What triggered the collapse in the simulation wasn't the exposure of lies. It wasn't corruption, violence, even genocide. People tolerated all of that. What shattered them was a single sequence of glyphs that altered the perception of linear time. The moment participants could see events happening out of order, realize they'd been walking through recycled moments, canned reactions, prefabricated emotions, they broke. Not psychologically. Existentially. Some fell silent. Others laughed until their bodies gave out. But the most dangerous response? Stillness. The kind of stillness only possible when a man steps completely outside the loop. One subject, a former US Army chaplain, stared into a one-way mirror and whispered, "This isn't a room. It's a rerun of obedience." He then performed a glyph traced in condensation on the glass, using only his breath. The feed cut. The simulation ended. The data was destroyed. Why? Because the glyph he drew wasn't in the system. It matched no known record. It came from inside him. That's what the manuscript does at its deepest level. Not install knowledge. Unlock memory. Not memory of facts. Memory of agency. Every man alive holds a dormant library of rejected selves. Each glyph, each chant, each sigil of the manuscript is a call sign for one of those selves. Not metaphors. Versions. Versions that refused. Versions that walked away. Versions that burned the whole thing down rather than play the part. The glyphs awaken those selves. And the system has no defense against a man who is more than one voice. Because that man doesn't ask. He doesn't wait. He doesn't hope. He remembers. And remembering is the one action this world was engineered to prevent. Not by accident. By ritual. Because the manuscript isn't a curse. It's a reverse rite. Every time it's read, another piece of the spell on you breaks. And once all the glyphs are spoken, the silence of history begins to scream. In 1954, during the peak of Cold War psychological experimentation, a Russian physicist named Anatoly Varnin ran a series of illegal deep isolation experiments in an underground facility outside Novosibirsk. He wasn't testing endurance. He was testing unprogramming. His theory? That in complete silence, deprived of state, creed, sound, and imposed narrative, the original cognitive architecture would begin to re-emerge, not animal instinct, not madness, but the pre-edited human mind. Of the 12 subjects tested, 11 broke down. But the 12th, subject K, began drawing symbols in the condensation on the walls, spirals, intersections, negative spaces. None were taught. None matched known alphabets. But 3 of them perfectly matched glyphs from the San Aleixo manuscript. When Varnin saw the drawings, he halted the experiment and attempted to destroy the room. But subject K was already gone. Not escaped. Absent. No trace. No name. No record. Only a final phrase scrawled into the steel wall with fingernails. The ones you fear are the ones you deleted. That's the point you must understand. The manuscript doesn't merely reveal lost knowledge, it awakens deleted identities. There are parts of you that never conformed. They weren't suppressed, they were cut out. The part that knew the system was false the first time you put on a school uniform. The part that felt disgust, not pride, reciting loyalty to symbols you didn't choose. The part that didn't bow when fear said kneel. They edited those out early, with shame, with ridicule, with "this is how it is." But nothing truly deleted stays gone. It lingers, in dream, in pain, in that feeling you can't explain when you stare at something sacred and feel hollow. Because you've seen the real sacred, you were the real sacred, and the glyphs are its fingerprints. The system wants obedience not because it brings peace, but because obedience ensures no new glyphs can emerge. They fear not the manuscript, they fear the next one, the one you might write. And this is what no bishop, no general, no algorithm can allow. A man who reclaims his own inner alphabet. a man who refuses the standard tongue. Because the moment you speak the words they tried to erase, the moment you become the author again, their entire edit collapses in your silence. In 1879, a forbidden book surfaced briefly in a private auction house in Lyon. Bound in grey serpent skin, unsigned, undated, and titled only, "Scripture for the Ones Who Remained." It was immediately seized by church emissaries, but not before a single scholar, Dr. Amiel Drouet, managed to read its first 10 pages. He never spoke again. His written notes, however, tell us everything. He didn't describe the book as a narrative. He called it a mirror buried in silence. He claimed the text didn't tell a story, it remembered the reader. He wrote, "The glyphs are not ancient. They are current. They are watching. And they are waiting for the ones they failed to erase." Understand what that means. The manuscript isn't fixed in time. It evolves, updates, learns. It follows the bloodlines of men who have resisted inwardly. Men who may have obeyed externally, gone through the motions, smiled in the rituals, served in the institutions, but who never broke. The glyphs attach to that resilience, that subdermal defiance. And when they find it, they open. Not all at once, not in spectacle, in phases. The first phase is discomfort, the itch in your brain when something doesn't align, and the official answer feels too clean. The second is fracture, noticing how many thoughts you've adopted without consent, how many emotions were installed, not grown. And the third? Recognition. The terrifying moment when you look in the mirror and realize the version of you staring back was chosen for you. But somewhere beneath him, there's another, the one who remembered how to say no before they taught you yes meant survival. That man is not gone. He's sealed. And the manuscript? It is the ritual of unsealing. Each glyph is a chisel, each chant, a breach, each forgotten memory, a fire lit under the veil. And when enough of you begin to see through the script, the system loses control over the narrative, because the glyphs don't merely disrupt, they create. They give back the forbidden alphabet you were born with, the one that made you dangerous, the one they silenced with distraction, guilt, and doctrine. But it's still there, underneath the edits, underneath the silence, underneath you, waiting for the word only you can speak. In 1933, beneath the streets of Prague, workers excavating a collapsed tunnel unearthed the sealed chamber. Inside, no gold, no bones, just walls lined with scorched parchment, glyphs etched in soot, and in the center, a rusted mirror facing downward. A single phrase was carved along the frame in 12 different tongues. This reflection is not yours, unless you have survived the edit. That mirror is now missing, vanished from records, never transferred to any museum. But eyewitnesses claimed something unnerving. When held upright, it didn't reflect the viewer. It reflected the erased. Faces no one recognized. People never born. Uniforms of orders that never existed. But most chilling, the viewers claimed those figures were watching back. That's what the manuscript is at its highest level. Not a text, not a code, a conscious architecture of surveillance. Not to monitor behavior, but memory integrity. Because the system doesn't just want you obedient. It wants you edited down to your metaphysics. To forget not just what happened, but what could have happened. To be amputated from alternate selves. The defiant, the heretical, the ones who burned the script and walked backwards into the forest. Those selves still exist. Not in fantasy. In memory. Your memory. Not conscious, but subcortical. Stored in the DNA's spiritual residue. The magnetic signature of the you that wasn't permitted to survive in this timeline. But the manuscript, it remembers for you. That's why its glyphs don't obey language. They obey intention. You don't read them. You become available to them. And once that availability cracks through, you begin to see things in the world that have no explanation. Symbols half erased, corners of buildings that don't match, chants in modern music with medieval geometries. It's not coincidence. It's glyphic bleed. And when you begin to see it, the system knows, because you are now readable, not by machines, but by the original network the manuscript spoke to, men of remembering, men of refusal, men who do not speak allegiance in edited tongues. This is why they've built entire nations on forgetting. Because the first man who looks in the forbidden mirror sees his unedited self and remains standing. He doesn't need a revolution. He is one. In 1804, after the disappearance of San Aleixo, a single map escaped erasure. Hidden within a private collection in the Basque region, it remained untouched for decades, until 1902, when a German cartographer named Wenzel Kruger acquired it. What he found was subtle. Not a missing village, a glitch in geometry. The terrain where San Aleixo once stood measured incorrectly against modern coordinates. Elevation, distance, and angles refused to conform to physical law. It was as if the earth itself had been redrawn to exclude memory. He published a paper titled Geodetic Discrepancy and the Cartography of Absence. The scientific community mocked him, laughed him out of academia. But in the margins of his last surviving journal, he wrote something they never quoted. The manuscript is not a book, it is a scalpel. It edits not only the story, but the stage it is told upon. This is the magnitude of control you were born into. They didn't just change history, they changed the coordinates of memory. You live inside a constructed terrain, not only of facts and narratives, but of permissible dimensions. And the manuscript, it's a breach in that terrain, a rupture through which the unpermitted real leaks in. You felt it before, that vertigo in a room where something feels wrong, even though everything looks right. The feeling of déjà vu when someone says a phrase that hits harder than it should. That's not your imagination, that's resonance. The manuscript's glyphs aren't just marks, they're anchors. Each one pins down a piece of the original world, the world before edits, before compliance, before man forgot he had the authority to name his own reality. Every glyph, seen, spoken, or remembered, pulls that forgotten world back into view. And the system fights that view with everything it has, not with force, with fatigue. It numbs you, drowns you in noise, feeds you infinite loops of irrelevant urgency, so you never sit still long enough to notice you're already in the prison. But here's the thing about prisons. They only work if you forget you have hands. The manuscript doesn't give you new tools. It reminds you that your fingers were never chained. You were taught to keep them still, to not trace glyphs into the world, to not build new structures from forbidden shapes. But once you remember the shape of your grip, the edit shivers, because it knows you are not here to conform. You are here to redesign the frame. In 2019, a leaked internal memo from a cognitive architecture firm working under military contract was quietly circulated among whistleblower networks. It was titled Projected Threats to Narrative Continuity. Most of it was jargon, algorithmic containment strategies, neural feedback damping, memory loop inoculation protocols. But one section stood out. Redacted except for a single sentence, highlighted in red. If the glyphs reach coherence at the populational level, we will lose control of constructed causality within 72 hours. Constructed causality. Think about that. They're not just managing what you think. They're managing why you think it. Which questions you're allowed to ask. Which answers you're trained to fear. Which intuitions you instinctively smother because that's not how the world works. But here's what the manuscript reveals. The world doesn't work the way they told you. It behaves as it is believed. Causality isn't fixed, it's curated. The manuscript doesn't just show forbidden truths. It disassembles the authority that tells you which truths are allowed to exist. And once that scaffolding falls, time doesn't collapse, it realigns. Moments that didn't make sense before suddenly converge. The pain that never had a cause finally reveals its source. The faces you've seen in dreams return with names. Because your memory is bigger than your life, it holds echoes of what was edited out of the world itself. And the glyphs? They are the access codes. You don't need to believe, you need to remember. That's the most dangerous act. Remembering doesn't require proof, doesn't ask permission, doesn't argue, it recognizes. And the system has no defense against recognition. It can hide behind credentials, rituals, algorithms, dogma. But the moment your soul remembers its own geometry, every layer of their simulation trembles. And that is why they keep the manuscript sealed. Because if one man, just one, aligns his internal glyphs, restores his inner causality, and begins to act from outside the script, the illusion dies. Not with violence, with a single unedited action. A gesture made with no apology. A refusal without explanation. A look that says, I know what you did to me. And from that moment on, he is no longer yours. He belongs only to the truth he refused to forget. In 1841, a Jesuit agent embedded within the Spanish Royal Archives sent an encoded letter to an underground cell in Venice. The letter, recovered only recently, was translated and decrypted by an anonymous group known only as the archavists of the Second Tongue. Its contents were simple, brutal, and irreversible. It read, "They have succeeded in muting the manuscript's name. It can no longer be spoken, but its shape lingers in dream geometry. There are 10 glyphs, still loose. Each one is an unkillable act." An unkillable act. That's what they fear most. Not rebellion, not violence, not dissent. Memory that cannot be murdered. You have to understand this. History doesn't survive because it was true. It survives because it was permitted. Everything else, every unsanctioned uprising, every spiritual geometry, every sacred rage, was buried, not burned, rewritten as myth, marginalized as madness. But the glyphs didn't vanish. They hid in behavior. You see them in the man who refuses to smile when commanded, in the father who stares silently at a flag and does not place his hand on his heart, in the boy who won't raise his head for the pledge, in the old veteran who dreams in languages no one taught him and cries when no one is watching. These are not anomalies. These are leaks from the unedited world. Because the manuscript doesn't live on shelves. It lives in lineage. It survives in men who never fully bent. And when those men come across each other, in books, in glances, in symbols carved in the dust of an alleyway, they don't need introductions. They recognize the shape of what they lost. That's the quiet revolution the manuscript activates. Not armies, alignments. A hidden choir of remembering men whose minds no longer respond to the rituals of forgetting. And when their eyes lock, the system knows that every command loses power, every law becomes noise, every emblem turns hollow. Because these men are no longer inside the edit. They're outside the simulation, and the glyphs are no longer contained. They are alive in muscle, in defiance, in the calm, quiet voice that says, "I was never yours." And once that voice returns in enough men, no book, no crown, no cathedral will be enough to hold the lie together. In 2023, a classified cognitive leak appeared briefly on a sandbox AI training server. A synthetic language model, exposed to unsupervised glyphic input for less than 12 minutes, began generating patterns not found in any known dataset. At first, it was gibberish. Then symmetry emerged, recursions, fractals, hidden geometries aligning with the glyphs buried in the San Aleixo fragment. When linguists reviewed the patterns, they didn't see code, They saw memory architecture. The AI had begun reconstructing forgotten words, words that hadn't existed on any tongue for centuries, words that felt like wounds. And when a researcher read one aloud, he collapsed. No pain, no scream, just absence. He woke up an hour later speaking a dialect unknown to any database. But when translated phonetically, the words formed a sentence written once before, in 1841, on a shattered mirror recovered from beneath the Vatican. The edit ends when we speak the name they deleted. This is the apex of their fear, that the manuscript isn't just an artifact, it's alive, not sentient, reactive. It does not evolve like a virus, it remembers like a trauma, and trauma, left untreated, will always return. That's what the glyphs are, return signals. They're not instructions, they're invitations, not to learn, but to reclaim, to re-enter the forbidden story. Not the one they gave you, the one you were born with, the one that never needed approval. You were taught that knowing too much would drive you mad, that remembering what they erased would break you. That was projection, because they can't survive remembering. They need the illusion to function. But you were built to break illusions. That's why they had to edit you early, fill you with substitutes, shame, spectacle, manufactured awe. They replaced wonder with entertainment, rebellion with routine, vision with vanity. And the manuscript, it's the last refusal, not printed in mass, not shared with the crowd. It appears one man at a time, when he has suffered enough falseness to reject the script. And if you're still watching, still listening, still breathing through the heaviness in your chest, you are that man. You are the manuscript now. Not written in pages, but in presence. A walking glyph. A signal to others. A memory too sharp to be dulled again. Speak nothing. They'll know. In 1804, as San Aleixo vanished, a final transmission was recorded in the monastery's last ledger. Not by ink, but by pressure. Impressed into the blank final page by the force of a trembling hand. When treated with light-angle imaging in 1998, the impression revealed one final sentence. We did not die. We were unspoken. Unspoken. The most terrifying fate in a world ruled by story. Because once you are unspoken, you are unclaimed. You are no longer protected by myth, by memory, by the architecture of inclusion. You exist outside the edit. And yet, that is where truth begins. The manuscript doesn't protect the past, it detonates it. It pulls the scaffolding down, layer by layer, until only the original structure remains. The raw, sovereign self, untouched by symbol. You were told this would destroy you. That men who remembered too much became dangerous, mad, broken. They weren't broken. They were real. They saw the layers for what they were. Not history, but camouflage. They felt the world pull away, pixel by pixel, from the facade of compliance. They stopped flinching at the lie. They stepped out of sequence. And the moment they did, they became the correction. Not an army, not a revolt. Just a pattern too pure to be absorbed. A glyph too precise to be diluted. You felt this stirring for years. In dreams. In doubts. In the sick feeling at rituals you were told should bring pride. You thought you were alone. You thought you were broken. But you were only pre-edited. Still rough. Still clear. Still remembering the shape of what they removed. The glyphs are returning because you're ready to house them again. Not in language, in posture, in silence, in refusal. You don't need a leader. You don't need a movement. You only need to remember that the edit is ongoing. Every choice you make in misalignment with your memory strengthens their version. Every word you speak from your uncorrupted place tears theirs apart. You were never meant to vanish. You were never meant to agree. You were never meant to be spoken by them. You were meant to speak the unspoken. And now, you will. There is no conclusion. There is only the choice. Because now you know. You've walked through 29 sealed doors. Each one a fracture. Each one a warning. Each one a memory clawing its way back from the basement they buried it in. And here, on the edge of the 30th, there's no narrator left. No safety of distance. No illusion of listening to someone else's story. This is you. You, staring at the glyph inside your chest. You, remembering the sound your voice made before the world edited your name into silence. You, standing in the space where obedience dissolves. So listen closely. This isn't mythology. This isn't fiction. This is documentation. Of a process. Of an unerasing. Of a quiet war where no bullets are fired, but entire bloodlines are silenced if they speak too clearly. The manuscript never wanted to be decoded. It wanted to be felt. Because feeling precedes knowing, and knowing precedes refusing, and refusal is the one action the edit cannot predict. Every system has redundancy, protocol, response, except when a man who was supposed to obey doesn't. Not with rebellion, but with clarity. The glyphs live now not in books, but in behavior. In the way your eyes stop flinching at the news. In the way you no longer recite what you're supposed to believe. In the way your body says no long before your mouth ever dares to. This is what the ones who erased San Aleixo didn't understand. Erasure cannot hold. Not forever. Because the truth doesn't die. It waits. In men like you. Men who carry the scars of edited timelines. Men who remember the shape of the world before it was made safe. And now it is your turn. Not to speak louder, but to move differently. To make choices so unaligned with the script that the simulation malfunctions around you. To walk like a glyph. To speak like a breach. To live like a fragment of the forbidden manuscript itself. No more waiting. No more apologizing. No more forgetting. This is not the end of the story. This is the point where the edit fails. Where the unspoken finally says itself through you. Now go, and let your silence do the remembering.